Welcome to the Manhattan Institute conversation on rent regulation and the future of housing affordability in New York City. I'm Raihan Salam, president of the Manhattan Institute, and it's my great pleasure to be with you today. Our event is hosted by The Beat, our newsletter delivering facts about issues that matter most to New York. Our team at The Beat draws on the work of MI scholars to be your go-to source for news and analysis. The Beat's hosted conversations on transportation, quality of life, and mental illness. And now, rent regulation, a topic that couldn't be more timely or important for all of us in New York. Lawmakers in Albany recently passed some of the most ambitious rent regulations in the state's history. These rules were aimed at housing affordability, especially in New York City. The ink hadn't dried on Governor Cuomo's signature before a heated debate ensued. Did we go too far or not far enough? And most importantly, what will actually move the needle on housing affordability? We at MI think that affording a roof over your head is so important that we can't leave this debate to op-ed pages. We believe in the value of a good discussion. To lead that conversation, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists, starting with our moderator, Alyssa Katz, deputy editor of The City. We then have Brad Lander, a member of the New York City Council representing the 39th District in Brooklyn. Ingrid Gould, the Paulette Goddard Professor of Urban Policy and Planning at New York University and a faculty director at the NYU Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy. And last but not least, Howard Husock, our senior fellow and City Journal contributing editor at the Manhattan Institute. Alyssa, over to you.
Thank you so much. So the reason that we're all gathered here with these stellar panelists, who are, by the way, the three people I would call first to talk to about what do these big changes in rent regulation actually mean for New York, is that rent laws have just changed in some pretty dramatic ways. And in one sense, what has happened, and this affects nearly 1 million apartments in New York City, some housing in counties outside New York City as well. In some senses, just a reversion back to rent laws more or less as they existed in 1997, before the state legislature and then Governor George Pataki undertook some pretty ambitious efforts to loosen the restrictions and move some apartments outside of the regulatory system. In some other ways, this new law goes further with implications that I think everyone in the housing world and in New York politics is still, and in real estate, is really still figuring out, right? And so necessarily this conversation is going to be based on a mix of evidence and data, on history and experience, and also on a little crystal ball line. There's going to be some speculation here, and we all have to be comfortable with that, but it's going to very much draw on the things that we know from years of rent regulation and rent control in New York, innovations in other states going on right now, as well as, the landscape here in New York right now. And just to list a few of the changes, just to wrap our heads around it. So in addition to limiting and actually eliminating landlords' ability to increase rents upon vacancy just because a unit is vacant, and then raise rents up to a point at which, at a certain dollar threshold, units may be taken out of the regulatory system entirely. The new measures have a number of other protections targeted to tenants. For example, a landlord or broker cannot charge more than $20 for a background check. If a tenant is facing eviction proceedings in housing court, under certain circumstances, a judge may give them time to find another apartment in the same neighborhood. The law also substantially increases penalties that may be found in court against landlords who've been found to have overcharged tenants in violation of these laws. And significantly, it also limits the dollar amount, percentage of the cost that landlords may pass on to tenants for making improvements to apartments or to their buildings. And I think that's an area that we'll be discussing quite a bit because it's significantly lower than in the past and could have implications for housing quality that we should be concerned about. So with that, I want to just turn to our panelists and start with a jolt of a question, I think, which is just, to predict 10 years from now, with the law as we know it, just name what you think the #1 consequence will be to the rental market in New York City as a result, assuming this law stays in effect as is all this time, what the impact will be. Starting with you, Brad Lander.
All right, well, I'm going to go aspirationally here, because as somebody who has thought of myself my whole career as a pro-growth progressive, what I hope the impact will be politically, which is like the lens, you got a politician sitting on the panel for, is more of a willingness for people to lean into some model of inclusive growth in the city. So if you think about the landscape, anybody faces approaching a rezoning today, what you approach is believing people will overwhelmingly oppose it, especially if it's in a low-income or working-class community, because they believe they will be displaced by rising rents and new development with no confidence that they'll have the ability to stay in their neighborhood and benefit from new growth and development. And what I hope 10 years from now is that if you've got a track record of people being able to stay in their neighborhoods as rents rise because the rent laws protect them, that they'll fear less that a new development around the corner that creates a bunch of new units will push them out of their neighborhood, and that we'll have a politics that makes inclusive growth something we could actually plan for rather than sound like a slogan that nobody believes in.
Okay, Ingrid.
So I'll do a little crystal balling, I guess. And I just want to sort of, I think that I hope Brad's right. I think that there is something to be said for sort of forging grand bargains, right? That combine some level of tenant protections with growth. I do think that from what do we know about sort of the research from what on rent regulation in other areas, that I think we know that tenants will likely stay in the sort of sitting tenants will stay in their units for longer. They will pay lower rents, but that we may also see a reduction in overall supply of rental housing. There's certainly an incentive. There's less of an incentive now for landlords to reinvest in their property, more of an incentive to sort of convert away. And so, I think that's the trade-off. I think the other thing that I'd say like I said, I think on the one hand, I think rent regulation, the research suggests that it succeeds at its most direct goals, which is to protect sitting tenants from exorbitant rent increases, and helps enhance the security and stability of their tenure at the same time that it may discourage investment in the existing stock. I think the other thing that I worry about, and I think this is sort of a progressive argument, maybe or cautionary note about rent regulation, is that it also might change the kind of screening that landlords do, right? They're going to be more cautious about who it is that they're going to let into their units. They're also going to have more of an ability potentially. If more people are lined up to come into your to rent your unit, then you're going to have more of an ability to be sort of choosy.
We can talk later about the great new law Portland has passed that makes it much harder for people to discriminate through screening.
That's right. No, I think that's
at.
important. And look, we have past source of income discrimination law in New York, but you need to have those protections. You need to have enforcement as well. So,
my concern about what will happen centers on the reimbursement that's allowed for physical improvements. And to be specific about that, the new law allows only $15,000 of renovations to be passed on to tenants over 15 years. Think about that, and think about the costs of renovation the last time anybody in this audience did any work on the place where you live. I think that as a result, we are at risk of concern about gentrification in New York being replaced by what I call shabification. Disinvestment, because if you're only going to get X for your unit, no matter what you invest, or no matter who you rent to, the possibility of units becoming shabbier and shabbier and shabbier is very real, with the potential for no specific advantage in terms of the inclusive New York that you're talking about for people of low income. We already know that, according to the Furman Center, 23% of households in rent-stabilized units have lived in their units for 20 years or more, and many of them are overhoused. That is, they're empty nesters, their kids have gone, they stay even though they don't need that unit, And there's very little incentive, in fact, no incentive for property owners to rent to people of low income because they want to get paid. If you can be sure you're going to get paid by renting to somebody who has a high income, even though they're paying a low rent, you'll do that. Witness the New York Times recent story about the gentleman on Central Park West who's paying $2,600 for an apartment with a view of Central Park, who says, I'm never going to move. Right? That is not a policy that's inclusive for poor people in New York, who should be the central concern, I agree, of a dynamic city.
So can I just interject for 1 second? I feel like I'm sitting between the hopes and the fears here, so I mean, I think that, and I think, you know, whatever, as a researcher, we need to do more research on this, and it's great. This is useful to sort of crystal ball, and but I do think that we need to be monitoring what's happening.
I think it's probably also a good bet that 10 years from now we will not have exactly today's policies with no changes having been made at the city or the state level.
Hope so.
So hopefully
That's
we
right.
can use the
That's
research
right.
to adjust dynamically in real time.
Yeah.
Sure. One thing I should have mentioned earlier, you should all have a way to write down questions on note cards. I think they've been provided to you, right? So we will have Q&A after the main of this discussion. And so if you have questions, write them down. Somebody will come collect your card and we will read your questions. So I wanted to move from the realm of the crystal ball to the here and now, just to hear your observations about what, if any, signs you may have discerned so far. I know it's early. This new law went into effect in July for the most part, but signs out there about an impact, things that are changing, whether you're hearing them anecdotally, anything at all.
Well, of course, there's great relief amongst tenants who were fearing displacement and experiencing harassment, probably most specifically and narrowly for those folks with preferential rents. That's a third of the stock. So, a third of a million units, about 800,000 people living in units where the preferential rent was registered lower than the legal registered rent. So as soon as rent increases in your neighborhood as a result of rising rents from gentrification or otherwise, just meant that the rent lifted, you knew you were gone. So you had 800,000 New Yorkers, mostly low and moderate income, but I don't mind middle income people also not having to live in fear, who genuinely feared displacement from their neighborhood and that their rent regulation protections were essentially meaningless as soon as that lease renewal came up. And I've talked to a bunch of them, and like the security that comes from knowing you could stay in your home even as rents rise and your neighborhood gets better is enormous. Like what it means for how you think about your kids and how you invest. And so, that I've just talked to a lot. That's anecdotal for sure, but I'm confident if you did a survey, you'd find it too. There really is a palpable relief amongst a set of tenants who have come to, for good reason, but amplified by the zeitgeist and the media, substantially feared that they would not be able to stay in their homes.
Well, I'll quote the Wall Street Journal, having quoted the New York Times. The new law, in summary, makes it harder for landlords to raise rent, evict tenants, or convert rent-regulated buildings, units into market rate or condos. Investors are betting, this was not the editorial page, by the way, this is the news columns of the Wall Street Journal. Investors are betting that the values of rent-stabilized buildings will fall by more than 25%. There's already a guy who borrowed a lot in bonds. On the Israeli bond market, he's taken a 40% hit.
Fantastic.
Fantastic, except the largest source of revenue for New York City is the property tax. And if the value of buildings goes down, that diminishes the city's property tax base on which it relies to maintain playgrounds, parks, subways, all the public infrastructure that benefits who? Poor people.
And making policy by being unwilling to call out the most egregious speculators without any regard for what they were doing, the policy of the city, that is how we got here. Might we have been able to make some more nuanced decisions about the policies earlier this year if there had been a willingness to think about adjustments, but no, I think probably the folks in the room are not the ones who are harassing and evicting and displacing and speculating. Look, a lot of the values where people are seeing a hit to their values is because, as happened at Stuytown, as happened many other places, people speculated on a price that everyone knew could not be sustained by legally following even the old rent regulation laws, which had tons of loopholes. People speculated on pushing tenants out through a mix of illegal and illegal means, were able to get properties valued at that amount. Now, this is at the edge of the market. The worst actors were doing this. But there was not a willingness in the real estate community, in partnership with those of us who were trying for more modest loophole closing at every rent regulation renewal since 1997, to close loopholes that the most egregious actors were driving trucks through. And as a result, this is the political landscape you got.
Well,
and so if you're gonna use as an
the
example,
downdraft in values is not going to be limited to speculators, quote unquote.
Then-
the downdraft will affect all rent-stabilized buildings that are 1.1 million units.
To some extent, but we don't know yet the magnitude of that, right? So I think you
I'm
are
just reading what the
you're-
reporters are saying.
Right, but they don't know, right? They're crystal balling
Well,
too.
I think
That
what Brad is
there's-
speaking, oh, sorry, yeah.
No, I was just going to say that. I mean, I think it's pretty. I can't imagine that property values won't fall. I think the question is the magnitude of the fall. I think it's very likely that you're going to see a reduction in speculative buying, and you did have some prices that were clearly way out of line with what the rent rolls were. Now, how this balances out.
Right.
We're hearing anecdotally also that you're also seeing. Landlords are less now less likely to take tenants to court now, right? To housing court, because they just don't have the same incentive anymore to evict tenants. So, I don't know. Again, that's anecdotal. We're starting some research where hopefully, a year from now, hopefully we'll have some answers. Although really,
We're both
might
for
have
more
to wait
research,
10 years.
Ingrid, definitely.
Yeah, I know. No, we might have to
100%.
wait 10 years to get the real answers. But
Ingrid, what are the indicators that you are going to be looking at?
Yeah, so I think we'll look at property values. We would like to look at, and if anyone has the sources of data in this room, come talk to me afterwards or come talk to Mark. I think we'd like to look at the sales. We'd like to look at who is buying. We would really like to look at the multiples, the prices relative to what's the sort of price-rent ratio, what's the cap rate that people are buying at. We would like to look at evictions. We would really like to look at maintenance and repairs. We'd like to look at sort of how many MCIs are being done, what are the housing renovations.
Major capital improvements.
Exactly, thank you. Major capital improvements. We would also, I would really like to look at tenant screening to see sort of who is getting into buildings, and is Howard right that now there's going to be an incentive to take sort of the squeaky clean, only accept the squeaky clean tenants, because now the really low risk tenants, because now you think those tenants are going to be in your
Well, in fact, I
housing
will
for
say
longer,
anecdotally, so my news organization, The City, we've been covering the implementation of the new rent laws, and one thing that we started hearing from tenants who were writing into our tip line was simply that the moment they started asserting their rights, sometimes because they had read our stories explaining to them their rights, the landlords would shut them down. They were basically screening them out for being sophisticated about knowing their rights. They said, we don't want you. Or at least it was the brokers doing this. So I think that, anecdotally, I think we're seeing that as well.
But by the same token, I think that some of the regulations in the new law enacted with the idea of protecting tenants may do tenants harm. I'll give you two examples. Security deposits. It used to be you could ask for first and last month's rent, maybe an additional month's rent. Now you can ask for only 1 month's security deposit. Those with spotty credit histories are less likely to be rented to, because landlords cannot have the assurance of having more than 1 month of security. Also, evictions. Now, evictions sound like something we should always protect people from, and 800,000 people are sleeping easier. There can be bad tenants who are problems for other tenants. And it may be important for the peace and quiet in a building, for the decorum, for law and order, for those tenants to be evicted in a timely way. That happens too.
So, Brad, you started speaking to something that I've wanted to ask you about, which is kind of the political climate, right? You had a political climate created by, the aggressive use of these loopholes, the speculation, and then the deregulation, right, of hundreds of thousands of formerly regulated units. And I'm wondering, as we begin to see the impacts, and I think that, I don't think anyone on this panel disagrees that there'll be some externalities, some unintended consequences, some need, as you were saying, potentially to adjust the laws, right? And I want to get your feel for politically, is there a likelihood in the coming session, in the coming couple of years, that Albany will actually revisit any of this and be paying attention? Or is the climate such that this train has left the station, the law is going to be what it's going to be, and let the chips fall where they may?
Well, look, I mean, one thing I think most folks in the room probably know, but bears saying, is one important change in the way the renewal was done this time is that it is a permanent renewal as opposed to an every 4-year or 5-year sunset. For a period of years, the rent regulations and the 421A tax break sort of traveled together to enable a kind of bargain.
Right.
But I think the tenant side felt increasingly like that bargain was just more loopholes in the rent laws and nothing for them on the 421A side, even if some adjustments were being made as would regard new development. So people got pretty fed up with that. So, I mean, it seems to me pretty unlikely that this coming year, they've got a lot to do in Albany. They got many years when things were not getting done. So I doubt there'll be a return to the rent laws in 2020. But housing's going to remain an extremely important issue for people to pay attention to over time. So yes, I think there's every reason to believe that we'll be coming back to it. I hope we're coming back to it in newer and better ways. And I mentioned growth at the beginning. But if you look at California, which has some similarities to some things about the New York market, they're having a debate both about rent regulations and about growth and transit-oriented development and where it should be allowed and what growth should be taking place in the suburbs and the metro region. We have almost none of that taking place in Albany. We have some of that conversation here in New York City, but we can't solve our housing crisis and certainly not our supply crisis alone within the 5 boroughs. So what I hope we could do is actually build toward the kind of coalition that Ingrid's talking about, where what comes back to Albany is some thinking about supply and fair share and transit-oriented development. It occurs to me that like the folks on Long Island who were so upset about Amazon not coming, if you had said to them, well, are you going to allow housing growth in your communities for the new workers? No way they would have. So are we going to do the work together to build a coalition that comes back to Albany with attention to thoughtful and inclusive growth, balanced with tenant protections, and in that context, then I think we could make some of the adjustments that we probably will need to, and we were kind of talking about this before at the beginning. I think it's reasonable to worry that in some buildings, problems will emerge as a result of lack of investment and upkeep over time. So how do we think about that? It's easy to say, well, what we were doing before was pretty much allowing landlords to do very large claims for improvements without a whole lot of regard of the income of the tenant, the need of the building, or the circumstances of the situation. And so we should just go back to that. I would prefer a situation where our first order is like, let's protect tenants from being displaced rather than worry that because if we're worried, like the most important thing is not having a shabby unit, we know what the result is. Beautiful units and pushing low-income people out. We could take other tactics to saying in the stock, like I think it's probably time to look again at the J51 tax abatement program and target it to the places we think it's needed the most, in the places that have genuinely low or moderate rents, with tenants who are lower or moderate income, and where there's some evidence that the building needs repairs and improvements. So those are the kinds of policies I hope we will be coming back to, maybe not in 2020, but certainly over the next 3-4 years.
I'll tell you why I think there will be ferment in 2020. And that's because even though we're cloistered here in New York City, this new law extended local option to adopt rent regulation to the whole state. I was just in Buffalo last week speaking before a group of local property owners. They were blindsided by this, right? The last thing Buffalo, Rochester, Utica, Schenectady needs is rent regulation. They need investment of any kind. And by the way, here's the vacancy rate in Buffalo. The vacancy rate for units that are actually available for rent is 5.5%. The total vacancy rate is almost 10%. That's because there's so many abandoned units.
But so let's be clear, you can only opt in
If your
If your
vacancy
vacancy
rate
rate is below 5%.
Rochester's
so-
4.9%.
Yeah,
Okay, but
So
start with Buffalo. I mean,
they can opt in.
You know the
What
place
I'm
that's
saying
gonna
is
do
there
it
are
first?
artificially low vacancy rates because there are so many abandoned houses upstate. The last thing they need is anything that discourages investment of any kind.
I
And
think we
those
agree
property
there,
owners
yeah.
are up in arms,
yeah.
and they are talking to their assembly members and senators, and that could make for a surprise in Albany.
But let's be clear, it's up to municipalities whether they adopt in or not, and your vacancy rate has to be below 5%. So Buffalo can't, and other jurisdictions only will if they vote to by a democratic vote of their elected officials. I happened to be this past weekend with some elected officials from around the state, and I think Kingston will be first. The mayor and the
Yeah.
council at Kingston are looking at it. Kingston is experiencing a whole lot of gentrification as New Yorkers have increasingly brought property there, and their tenants that it also only covers units over 6, buildings over 6 units, which is a much lower percentage of the housing stock outside of New York City. So you're talking about regulating a pretty modest percentage, in most cases well less than a third, in some cases just like 5 or 10% of the stock. In all the other places, investment continues apace. And if that's what it takes to have longtime residents at Kingston not fear that they're going to be displaced by New Yorkers buying second homes,
I think I think we all can agree that, right, that rent regulation is not an appropriate tool for Buffalo, right? For cities upstate that are, experiencing, and continuing to experiencing disinvestment. I think the question is what you are assuming, right, is that it's sort of only the places that really need it will adopt it. You're assuming that it's going to come potentially with other kinds of investment. And I think the problem is that a lot of these communities sort of think that all they need to do, right, all they do is adopt rent regulation, and they're not actually strategically
well, I can promise you that's
about.
not the case, because I literally was with people from Rochester, Kingston, Hudson. I got a long list. I posted it on my Twitter of all the places that are talking about it.
Yeah,
no
these
one
are right.
thinks it's
Right.
a panacea to
good.
your other problems. People want to have access to home ownership, and they want to think about how they get there. Places that don't have growth want to have growth and investment.
And you think actually that it will, and I'm saying you continue to believe that it actually will help, if you make renters, sitting tenants feel more secure, that rather than acting like, you could argue that they're going to act more like NIMBY homeowners.
I mean,
right?
here's what I
Or
know.
you could say they feel more secure and therefore they're going to be more accepting of growth.
Look, political crystal ball is hard, and I have been wrong in many political predictions
than
that
I
I
know.
have made in recent years, but this I know for sure. Like,
Yeah.
I've been now doing, I've been in office 10 years, but doing kind of the politics of development and growth in real estate and housing in New York
Yeah.
City for 25. And the climate right now is so dramatically more hostile to growth and development than it was 10 or 15 or 20 years
Absolutely.
ago.
Yeah.
And what is the number one reason for that? The number one reason for that is that people fear they're going to be pushed out of their
And
neighborhoods.
that's around the country
by
too.
it.
It's not just,
So
it's not
can
just
I
New York.
guarantee
Yeah.
that easing that will make the growth politics better? Can't guarantee it, but I'm pretty sure if we don't provide those protections, I just don't know how we can persuade anyone to support it in their neighborhoods.
Well, I'll just say, vis-a-vis Kingston, since you mentioned it, they have a local problem they call zombie houses. That is, they have so many empties, they've had a term that they've invented for it. So they are desperate for
I don't
investment.
think they invented the term zombie houses in Kingston.
Well, they have adopted that term. So that tells you something.
Buildings, it's only buildings over 6 units. So if you have a single-family home or a two-family home, no one is talking about it, being covered by the Emergency Tenant Protection Act. And you would only adopt it in places where a majority of the elected officials saw enough actual tenants in buildings of 6 units or more with a vacancy of 5% or less who were crying out saying, we believe we're going to be displaced by rising rents. Otherwise, no one would adopt it. So,
Well, Ossining, by the way, adopted it. 2 city council members were defeated after having adopted it, and it was voted out right away.
yeah, because the real
So-
estate lobby paid a ton of money to defeat
Well,
those
that may be
candidates.
true. That may be true, but it
Definitely
may be
is true.
that there were actual people who had property that they were concerned about keeping up.
So I want to talk about 2 ideas that have not yet taken root in New York, but that are in the mix of discussion. One is the rent caps that Oregon and California have put into place, which in New York have been under discussion in the form of a just cause bill that has been floating around Albany in the past session. The other idea is means testing, the idea that regulated apartments should be accessible kind of in some relationship to need. The people who do not have economic need should not have benefit from this, what is now a kind of scarce resource, because remember, only about half, roughly, of the units in New York City are in fact rent regulated. So pick either or both of those ideas and chew on them for us.
Can I say just, let me start by just saying a little bit about sort of the Oregon and California case, which I see them as kind of a third generation form of rent regulation. They're really, I think, better framed as kind of an anti-rent gouging ordinances. There really are, I mean, there are three ways that I think they're different from New York. One is that they're more broad-based, so the coverage is greater. They're covering more rental properties, a much greater share. Secondly, but the controls, though, are much more lenient, right? So that basically in Oregon, you can raise your rent every year by CPI plus 7 percentage points. In California, it's CPI plus 5 percentage points. And importantly, upon turnover, landlords have the right to actually raise their rent back up to market. So it's really like a deregulation, re-regulation. And third, they're also just much simpler than the New York system and much more transparent, right? There's no rent guidelines board, there's no fighting and yelling at each other, the tenants and landlords fighting every year. It's not a political process, it's just set. There's an index, there's a formula. And I think there is, there's a lot that I think is appealing in that approach. I think that you know, my understanding of the proposal in New York is that the increase would be much smaller, right? It would be 1.5 times
the permitted
CPI.
maximum increase. It would be almost an aggressive rent control as opposed to, as you're saying, an anti-rent gouging measure.
And I think for sort of a statewide kind of policy, I think that an anti-rent gouging makes a lot more sense. I think you want to be more lenient to allow for different market conditions.
I mean, one imagines that if that is a plus. So I think people probably know, but this was proposed to be sort of on top of, so the units that are covered by the existing laws would be covered, all other rental units would be covered by this law, and one has to imagine there would be negotiations between the threshold of increase which is in the current bill and some of the models that exist in California and Oregon.
Right, so I've expressed concern about upper middle class tenants having a good deal. I think that is a kind of a inevitability with rent regulation. I think a means test is a wildly impractical idea that would have a lot of implementation problems. Every property owner would have to be getting the tax returns of every tenant. As with public housing, you would have a powerful disincentive not to earn more money. Is that a message we really want to send out to low-income New Yorkers? So I think that would be a bad idea. I think we need to let price signals return to New York.
Sounds like the means testing, we might have one thing we at least all agree on.
Well, I think we need an allocation of units based on ability.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm on the one hand, I'm very sympathetic to the idea of means testing, and it's one of the things that I am least comfortable with about rent regulation is the fact that it's not means tested. On the other hand, it's very hard to see how to get there without disincentivizing landlords from accepting the low-income tenants whose rents are going to be regulated. I think it really would have to come with some subsidies. So, and then all of a sudden, it's really just a subsidy.
And this is why, I mean, to me, it seems like you're talking about two different things. Where we're putting subsidies, of course, we should means test so that we're targeting our scarce resources, the places where we need them both. I think a lot of us don't think of rent regulation not as a public subsidy, but as the basic idea that if you're living in a home that you don't happen to own and that somebody else owns, you've got the stability to know that you can stay there, and that if its value increases in a way that could otherwise push you out, you don't get pushed out, and that is I would want to extend that stability just as much to a middle-class tenant as to a low-income tenant.
Well, think about middle-class homeowners.
Like consumer protection.
Think about middle-class homeowners on Staten Island whose property taxes will go up because the property taxes on 6-unit and up buildings are going down. They may have to sell their homes and move out because their property taxes make their home unaffordable. that you are picking winners and creating losers. Now also in terms of the future of ferment, the Rent Stabilization Board Association is challenging this new law in court. And this is an important case. They're challenging it as a regulatory taking. The Supreme Court is not the Supreme Court that it was a few years ago. That is a serious case backed by a serious organization.
Yeah, and there's in fact 2 lawsuits now making the same claim. So, Howard, you have written about the impact of rent regulations on new development and construction.
Yes.
And I think that there's a lot of features in New York's new law and in the general regulatory environment that might blunt the impact of this law on construction. But I'm wondering if it is nonetheless a concern that you have about the laws that are in place right now, how you anticipate it might in fact affect the development environment, the creation of new units. And this is a question for all of you, but I wanted to throw
Well, I
this
think
to you.
developers are on the sidelines right now, waiting to see, and thinking about investing in Miami and not in East New York. And so
If that's how short-sighted they are, we really have a lot of problems.
if getting into inclusionary zoning, there was at least the possibility with the market rate units in an inclusionary zoning construct that you would get to the limit at which you'd be able to opt out, right? And there's no more opt-out. So I think that those investors who are saying, in the long term, I'm going to be able to get out from under rent regulation and realize what I consider to be a market rate return for my investors, they're going to stay on the sidelines because that's no longer the case.
Well, I mean, again, we don't know what's going to happen yet. We don't know what is happening to new construction yet. But I will say that in other research, it doesn't seem like the studies generally don't show that rent regulation laws have much of an effect on new construction, largely because basically, the newly constructed units are exempted between 15 and 30 and 40 years, depending on.
In inclusionary zoning units, they're rent stabilized.
But I'm saying that what is the the issue is, though, that there are other ways that supply can change, right? And the research does suggest that supply falls because of conversions, right? Incentivizing conversions, and potentially because of reductions in maintenance.
And you're saying
investment.
conversions,
That's,
just
I
to
think, the bigger-
clarify, you mean
like
conversions to condominiums and
conversions
co-ops?
to
or-
condominiums, co-ops, taking units off the market in some cases. Now that you might not see that as much. That's something that you've seen a lot in California because smaller buildings are, so owners will just take the unit off the market and decide to use it for their kids when they come and visit. But that will be less true in New York because we're focused on larger buildings. But
Okay. I also wanted to ask about enforcement because, again, one thing that has come to our attention at the city is, we've been looking at how the State Division of Housing and Community Renewal, which is the agency in charge of making sure that that they keep track of everyone's legal rents. They are supposed to intervene if overcharges or other problems are brought to their attention. And what we hear from tenants is that it can take years to get a case addressed. And a lot of violations are just going unaddressed that don't have even to do overcharges. And I'm just wondering, you can have a strong law, but if you don't have enforcement, or if that enforcement is so slow as to be meaningless, how does that actually affect the law's implementation? I know that's a theoretical question, but I'm wondering, we've had this problem for a long time. I think it's only intensifying now with the stronger law. So how do you see that playing out, and what, if anything, can be done to rectify this?
It's a good question. I mean, one little thing that can be done to rectify it that I think the state agency, HCR, is working on is just a so much better system of data and transparency, like the data infrastructure for just keeping track of where things are and making it visible to people is nowhere near where it needs to be. And so you wind up in these systems where, like, you got to have a lawyer just even to get your rent overcharge complaint, where you should just be able to go online and get it yourself. So I think there is some room for kind of strengthening what can be done with data and transparency. Look, it's a system. This is a highly jerry-rigged kind of hire professionals system, right? And so we had this long period of time where the loopholes were opening, The laws were on the side of the landlords, and landlords were almost certain to have a lawyer, and tenants were almost certain not to have one. And so then we came in and said, let's make sure tenants have lawyers too. And obviously you shouldn't have a system where one side does and the other side doesn't. So now increasingly both sides do, and that's a good thing. But yes, as laws change and lawyers represent, you'll have a lot of situations where things we might hear even between a panel that disagrees, we might be able to resolve in about 5 minutes, can go on for a long period of time. And you know, it'd be wonderful if we had a system that didn't do that and still balanced the interests of landlords and tenants fairly, but I don't know how we could get
it's
that.
an argument for the need for, I mean, I completely agree, of course, about transparency and the need for data, but I also think it's also just about simplicity, right? That when you create these really complicated systems and people don't, you know, tenants don't understand, landlords don't understand, everyone's got to lawyer up, I mean, and frankly, it's just going to be that much more difficult for these agencies that are understaffed to effectively enforce.
I really cringe at this discussion, and I'm interested that the councilman would talk about this as a jury-rigged system where everybody needs to get a lawyer. That's not a healthy market. 52% of the members of the rent stabilization property owners do not speak English as their first language. They have to deal with your jury-rigged system where everybody has to lawyer
tenants
up.
that don't is higher. So let's just be clear. This is not a case where like there's a disproportionate impact of non-English speaking on
Well, I'm not talking
landlords.
about that. I'm talking about they are small property owners who are putting their life savings into small buildings.
The complexity is not good for anybody. Yeah, I think we can all agree on that.
It's a
right?
dead weight
It's
loss,
just-
as the economists say.
It is.
But this is just where I'm going to go back and make the political point. The opportunities to do more creative and nuanced problem solving existed in prior political cycles before the refusal to amend the laws in any way got us to this point. And if like people don't learn that as a political lesson, we'll just keep fighting it out this way.
Well, was there a public hearing for this law?
I mean, there was not a shortage of conversation about changes
Was there a
to the
public
rent
hearing?
laws. I don't control the state legislature,
Okay.
obviously, but there was not a shortage of conversation. And I really think the idea that the problem is that there was that everybody just played fair and there was insufficient dialogue on the part of progressives. Again, you're welcome to think it, but like if what you want is a kind of realpolitik lesson.
Did the law surface before the last week of the legislative session?
Everybody knew what was being
bubbling up.
discussed and debated.
Everybody.
And I guess I just think
Those guys in
house.
Buffalo didn't know, I can tell you that.
Yeah.
I mean, almost
I'm
all the
sure
laws
they
had been passed in one house many years before
right.
that.
Yeah.
I guess this is just where like I feel like there's like a realpolitik lesson from like left to right, which is the opportunity to cut a better deal required people to be willing to name and identify bad actors and to restrict really outrageous practices before they just poisoned the well and led to a counter-reaction that swung this hard. And you don't have to like it, but that is what happened, and it could have gone differently.
Right.
Okay. I think we're just about out of time for the main panel, so we are going to turn to your questions now. Okay, for backers of these reforms, so I guess that's for you, Brad, how would you respond if the data shows that apartments are not being maintained? Please be specific.
All right. I got at this a little bit before. I think it's an important question. We need to pay attention to it. We have been at times in the history of this city when quality was a much worse problem than affordability, and that could happen again. Like the city, I've been around now long enough to see some different cycles. I was here during the tail end of abandonment, so we will have to pay attention to it. How to address it, I think that this is worth a real robust conversation, some of which we'd at least be able to do in the council. I think looking at J51, the tax abatement that exists for improvements, is a good place to do it. It's a better way to target and focus than kind of broad brush changes in the law. Could you look at modest adjustments to the MCI or individual apartment increase? It went from 6% down to 2%. Obviously, could you do it at 3%? There's some opportunities for specific adjustment in the laws, but I think we're overdue for a serious conversation about J51 and how it is thoughtfully targeted, and this might be an opportunity to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely that we need to be monitoring this, and I think that to the extent that we may see changes, I think the changes that we will see will likely be in the form of allowing landlords to recover more investment, right? I think that's That's where I think sort of the greatest concern is, that the pendulum may have swung too far. But the other thing is we also have the Rent Guidelines Board, right? So it also depends on, right, if the Rent Guidelines Board now says, okay, zero, freezes rents, then, that's going to be obviously more of a concern.
I'm glad to hear that the councilman is open to that, and that's a good thing. At the same time, when you're talking about J51 or 421A, those are the big guys. Right, you create a real estate market which becomes oligopolistic, and small landlords, small property owners, immigrant investors, they're not going to get J51 and 421A.
And just so folks are clear, J51 is basically a tax abatement, right? It's a program that landlords can use to get tax relief in exchange for doing investments in their properties. Okay, next question. Why have we adopted the premise that it is the government's responsibility to protect tenants, especially when we seem to be protecting tenants to the disadvantage of landlords? Landlords have similar concerns. This sort of speaks to what Howard was just talking about. Landlords have similar concerns that tenants do, e.g. providing a home for their families, food, et cetera. If landlords aren't generating sufficient revenue, isn't there a displacement concern for them?
I don't think so. I mean, I'd be glad to do like a survey of homeless New Yorkers, but I think the percentage of them that were landlords before they went to the shelters would be pretty small.
Yeah, I mean, I think what is fair to say is, look, there's a trade-off involved here, right? That rent regulation benefits sitting tenants at the expense of the tenants who are living in unregulated and who maybe want to move to New York who can't. And and on net, right, that maybe those two, I mean, the most recent study, the most rigorous study that we've done suggested actually those two kind of netted out. But, it's not clear, that's in San Francisco, it's not clear sort of where we are in New York. Clearly, they're going to be winners and losers. And, so I don't think that we shouldn't deny that fact. And the question is sort of how do we strike that balance?
Yeah, there's a difference between what's a fair balance between landlords and tenants, and aren't landlords just as likely to wind up displaced from their homes?
Absolutely.
So I mean,
I agree.
Well, I mean, landlords, you paint this kind of daddy warbucks picture of landlords, and I don't think that's accurate in most cases.
Okay, but I don't think.
But in terms of protecting tenants, which was the question, keep in mind we are not protecting all tenants. We're protecting incumbent tenants, those who have hit the housing lottery.
Right.
They were playing musical chairs, and when the music stopped and they pulled away the chair, they were lucky the ones they were sitting down in one of the chairs that was left. And we're protecting incumbent tenants, and the reason we made the decision is because they organized politically.
Okay. Next question. An under-discussed aspect of rent stabilization is that it effectively gives tenants a veto over whether buildings can be demolished and redeveloped at greater density, exacerbating the housing shortages that drive high housing costs. Should there be an exception for redevelopment, a maximum tenant buyout amount, some other reform to address the disincentive to develop?
I mean, I think if you're concerned about under-density in New York, you would focus on places where there were 1- and 2-family homes or row houses. Like the under-density crisis is not mostly a situation of rent-regulated multifamily buildings, that it would make sense to demolish, displace all those tenants and build a bigger building on it. So like, does that circumstance exist? That circumstance exists. But it is not the primary place that anybody that was serious, like if you're serious about how do we build a denser city to create more housing, I think there'd be like a dozen things you would do before you would say, please give me the ability to displace existing rent-regulated tenants, demolish a multifamily building, and build a bigger one.
Yeah, I worry about what I call the frozen city dynamic, where you have uses that are in place, a vast public housing system, some of which sits on very valuable land, proceeds of sale of which could be used to reimburse tenants for the long years they've lived there. The same with rent-stabilized tenants. They can be bought out because it may be that there's a higher and better use for that land, which actually would benefit a whole range of income groups in New York. So when you flash freeze dry, freeze something, I'm struggling here. the use that's in place, I don't think it will benefit the city in the long run.
This is actually an area where I think we agree a little more than we disagree. And certainly, like usually in progressive circles, I am the one taking heat for asking people to lean into a dynamic and growing city. And I think we all, like, on the one hand, as humans, we seem to have a cling to fear of things we might lose instinct. I really urge people to read Mohsen Hamid's brilliant essay that covered the National Geographic in July, which was just amazing on this. And that's not right or left or landlord or tenant, we fear loss of the things that we have.
It's an endowment effect, right? It's sort of it's an endowment that Kahneman and Tversky.
And then it leads us to hold in a way that makes it hard to achieve a kind of dynamic. And that's why we resist refugees, and that's why we might not like kind of immigrants moving into our neighborhood, and that's why we don't want new development, at least in part, it's why we don't want new development on our blocks. And if we're gonna make good public policy decisions, we need to be able to lean into dynamism and change against that instinct. So I really agree with it. But if you wind up in a place where it is separated by class, so what it looks like growth and change and development is benefiting a pretty small percentage of people. And it is a pretty small percentage of people, even if the landlord group is more diverse than sometimes I sound like it is, still a pretty small percentage of people that are gonna benefit from owning the growth. And then the set of people who feel included in its benefits shrinks over time, and quite the opposite. Not only do people not see themselves in the growth, they believe it's going to push them out altogether. It's just that is not a political climate amidst democracy where you could make good decisions. And so, yes, then you maybe wind up with a pendulum swinging too fast, but unless we can find a place to achieve a kind of more balanced conversation about inclusive growth in which people have some protections that their skin will be in the game, I don't know how you could ask them to do it. And I just say, I'm putting skin in the game here. I'm the only council member who's trying to rezone his community. I'm trying to bring 8,000 new units in between Park Slope and Carroll Gardens. And the only reasons we can do it are because the tenant protections are stronger, because there is some public housing that people know they can stay in, because we're trying to give people some sense of ability to balance. So this is where I think we're gonna have to find some balance between how we grow and how we preserve.
So can we say one thing, which is that, I think you're absolutely right in terms of people not feeling included in the growth, but in fact, but you sort of stated that only a small number of people actually benefit. But
through ownership.
Right, but I'm just saying you build new development, and that's going to sort of soak up some of the demand that's coming in. We need it, and it will sort of through migration chains end up opening up units in other parts of the city, and there's good evidence of that now. So, but that's not to say the perception is such that.
Yeah. But keep in mind, this thing ripples in so many unexpected ways. So, for instance, if capital improvements and repairs are limited, well, who did those repairs? Who delivered the new refrigerators? P.C. Richards, as I understand, is reporting refrigerator deliveries are down, stove deliveries are down. Small Hispanic contractors are the ones who are showing up and fixing those units. They're not big organized labor construction firms. And so the lack of the disincentive to repair units ripples through the economy just as much as gentrification, that is your concern, ripples through the economy.
I guess I don't think just as much. Yeah. I guess I don't think just as much.
So this is actually a question sort of even beyond the scope of rent regulation. How can there be affordable housing available in the market system without government subsidy? And one data point I will add to this is I think I was just reading Alex Schwartz's forthcoming paper for, I forget which journal, he's a professor at the New School who studies housing, and he said I think that it's $1,400 a month nut for an apartment in New York City, and that's assuming that the land is free. So a lot of people, a lot of households don't make $1,400, don't have enough income to sustain a $1,400 a month rent. So how do you deal with that?
Upzone the suburbs. I mean, I don't know what we will be able to do in the near term in New York City to make market-led development generate affordable housing without either subsidy or an inclusionary policy. There was a time, like now I've been in this a long time, like there was a time when the dialogue, what could we do to reduce cost of construction, might have resulted in affordable units for middle class people being produced by new construction. But I think, unfortunately, at the moment, it doesn't look to me like that's really even feasible. But on the other hand, if we thought about the metro area, there's a whole lot less expensive land and sort of a model of somewhat lower density, but still multifamily housing, well served by transit. All throughout the region, a lot more units could be created, and I think a lot more of that housing could be kind of affordable for the kind of family who's looking for a starter home or moving out, you know.
Yeah, we need to build more. We need to build more. We need to make sure we invest in transportation to continue to, so that those outlying areas are more accessible. But you know, I think that it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Really, it depends. I mean, that will help to sort of enhance affordability for moderate and middle income households, but for very low income households, you know, frankly, their incomes can't even support operating costs, and so we do need subsidies for.
I like the idea of densification of the suburbs. You've got to figure out a way to persuade people that they're not being punished for their lifestyle. So we have to be careful about how we frame the argument. You have to do your fair share for the poor. I don't think you're going to convince massive people on that basis. I just don't.
So you think environmental arguments?
They'll make the environmental arguments.
Well, but I'm saying, but the environmental arguments are the climate arguments also.
Could be.
Could be. We should be building near higher density near transit
And I'll say here, like, I mean, the question said just with subsidy, it's worth, like, I want us to do more inclusionary development. You know, the Gowanus rezoning is about, well, you know, is projected to be about 8,000 units, about 3,000 of them affordable, 1,000 on a publicly owned piece of property, and 2,000 through our inclusionary policy without subsidy. It'll be probably the first rezoning where the inclusionary policy works to take the market rate cross subsidy and build affordable units that don't need public subsidy. And the idea that you could have, you know, 2,000 units generated without subsidy on privately owned land in the neighborhood in between Park Slope and Carroll Gardens, but we can only keep doing that if we can get people to buy in for growth, and that's true in Massapequa just like it's true.
Let's just say this, I happen to live in a house that's 110 years old. I'm not sure where it's written that low-income households have to have new apartments, and that the filtering process that economies talked about forever has always worked. That is, people move into higher-end houses, houses become...
Right, but it doesn't work for, I'm saying, the extremely low income. It works for most of the market.
We have to decide, frankly, as social policy, whether we think it's appropriate to subsidize the lowest of the low-income households who have made certain lifestyle choices, shall we say. You know, I mean, it's basically...
I don't know that all of them made lifestyle choices.
Well, some of them have. Some of them have.
And I'm not sure who's better off by just having them sleep on the street.
Yeah.
Not on the street. But look, it doesn't have to be new housing. And by the way, in terms of free housing, NYCHA owns a lot of land.
Yes.
And I think that is the next frontier for new construction of affordable market rate housing. NYCHA owned land. And they should be welcoming this, and I think they will be, actually. I think Greg Russ, the new NYCHA chairman, is a real forward thinker and will be open to a lot of good ideas.
I agree with that, but don't take the suburbs off the table.
Okay.
Right? We have time for one more question, a kind of quick round. How can the legislature continue to support the inheritability of below market rent regulated apartments? This does nothing to address housing affordability for the truly needy. I think what this person is referring to is there's a right of succession, that if you are in a regulated unit, your immediate family members residing with you at the time that you die or whatever happens to you have a right to take over that apartment and right to lease renewals indefinitely.
True in public housing, too.
Yes. So I guess this is they're asking the question of a legislature, but I guess the question for you guys would be, is this a policy you think is warranted, is helpful, is useful for the purpose of preserving affordability?
Well, I guess, again, it goes to this sort of, I think there's two different, like, if your goal is how do you get the most kind of open, affordable housing, you have one lens. If your goal is this only applies to families who are already living there. So if you've got, like, parents with adult children who are living in their home and their parents die, and you say, guess what, goodbye. Like, I feel okay saying we put a restriction on landlords that absolutely has a cost and impulse, that lets those adult children stay in their home at a price that they can afford. That is a trade-off for sure. You could make them move out and make that unit available to someone else, but I don't think we should.
I'll echo Ingrid's point from a while ago where she talked about some of the losers are the people who want to move to New York who can't. And so the idea that you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere, that this is the city where you come to make it. We have low turnover in our housing now because it's so highly regulated. We pay a cost as a dynamic city for that. And so from the point of view of an individual household who may be disrupted, that's one thing. From the point of view of the whole city, where units do not become available for the new, ambitious entrepreneurs, creatives, all the immigrants, they won't have that opportunity.
Yeah, and I think that it's, I don't know that we really know the extent to which this is, how much of this turnover that we actually see. I think, again, I do worry a little bit about sort of the complexity of the law creating kind of gamesmanships and rent seeking, and so I think, but anyway, my guess is that this is not as much of a problem as people suggest. I certainly do think that we want to keep the city open to, that it is a cost, and we got to figure out exactly where to strike the right balance.
Okay, well, this has been a wonderful discussion. Please thank our panelists, Howard Husock, Ingrid Gould, and Brad Lander.